Hello, welcome to Converging Dialogues. This is Xavier Bonilla. On this episode, I am very pleased and very excited to bring you my conversation with Skye Cleary. Skye is a philosopher. She has an MBA and a PhD. She is the author of How to Be Authentic, Simone de Beauvoir and the Quest for Fulfillment. She's also the author of Existentialism and Romantic Love and the co-editor of How to Live a Good Life. She teaches at Columbia University and at the City University of New York. She is the former editor-in-chief of the American Philosophical Association's blog and advisory board member of Strategy of Mind, and a certified fellow with the American Philosophical Practitioners Association. I was super excited to talk to her. As I say in the conversation, her book is one of the best I've read this year, and we were planning this conversation for some time, and I believe we recorded this back in May, so some of the current event stuff we talk about might be a bit dated, but contents of the book and the contents of the conversation about de Beauvoir and philosophy are I think, for any time. We start by talking about her reasoning for writing the book. We talk about defining authenticity, existence before essence, which is a key component here, the other and intersubjectivity. She describes the Mystifications, which are critical for de Beauvoir's philosophy. We asked the question, and what is a woman? And this is really de Beauvoir's, the second sex. She's trying to answer that, and it's an interesting question. It doesn't really have an answer. You could say the same thing. What is a man? There are some answers obviously that people give, but when you really try to get down to it, all the pieces that compose of what these things mean, it's actually very difficult. We talk about the ideas of roles and some of the progress for women. We talk about contraceptives a little bit, and then we talk about some of the major themes she touches in the book towards the second half. Talk about on friendship, de Beauvoir on romantic love and marriage, and talk a little bit about her relationship with Jean-Paul Sartre. Talk about on motherhood, her idea of narcissism, and why rebellion is necessary. Again, I can't say how much of a joy it was for me to talk with Skye. She's an absolute delight. She's brilliant. Her book is fantastic. And I hope everyone is able to go pick it up and enjoy the conversation I had with her. So now I bring you Skye Cleary. I am here with Skye Cleary. Skye, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. I've been wanting to talk to you for quite some time, and so I'm very, very excited to talk to you about your book and about philosophy, and so I'm just very, very thrilled for you to be here.
Thanks, Xavier, and thanks so much for having me on.
Of course, yes. So we'll talk about your book, but first tell listeners who you are, what you do, what you think about and write on, all the relevant particular points.
Sure. My name is Skye Cleary. I'm Australian originally, but I live in New York City now. I am a philosopher, and I've written 3 books so far. My third one is coming out August 16, How to Be Authentic, Simone de Beauvoir and the Quest for Fulfillment. And so, I think about existential philosophy and specifically Simone de Beauvoir a lot lately. And I teach at a few different institutions. I teach at Columbia University. I teach at Barnard College and the City College of New York. And I also do some volunteering at a high school in the Bronx.
Oh, that's really nice. That's very, very nice. You've written 2 other books. They also are on, I think, loosely existentialism. Is this right? Or am I wrong on this?
Yes. Yeah, exactly. So my first book was Existentialism and Romantic Love. Mm-hmm. And that came out of my PhD, which was on that topic. So I turned it into a book. And I really, I wrote my PhD with the intention of trying to turn it into a book. So I was really pleased when that happened.
Very ambitious. I had that thought when I did mine, and then I said, yeah, never mind. I'm not. It was one fleeting thought, and then it went away.
Yeah. And then my second book, well, it was a co-edited volume with Massimo Piucci and Dan Kaufman, and it was on how to live a good life. And we collected 16 essays on different philosophies of life. So everything ranging from Confucianism and Buddhism and Hinduism to ancient Stoicism and Aristotelianism, and right up until sort of more modern philosophies such as ethical culture, and of course existentialism. So that was my essay on existentialism and how it had impacted my life.
Yeah, that's really wonderful. I guess what is it that you don't have to give me your biography, but what is it that got you into philosophy proper, and more specifically into existentialism as a specific or the specific subset of philosophy that you kind of hover around?
So I did study a year of philosophy in my undergraduate degree, but it was a very analytical kind of philosophy training or philosophy education, sorry. And it didn't grab me. I was like, yeah, this is fine, but it's not really for me. So I went off into finance and worked in financial markets and management consulting for a while. And then I did an MBA. And during my MBA in Sydney, there were some philosophers on faculty who taught classes like Existentialism and Entrepreneurship, or Foundations of Management Thinking, which was a philosophy subject that talked about Homer and Freud and all different philosophies, and which I loved. And I was like, wow, if I'd been taught philosophy like this in my undergraduate degree, I think my life would have gone a completely different path. And so I was hooked. And it was not only that I was learning about the existential philosophers, Simone de Beauvoir and Jean-Paul Sartre, especially at that time. It was also that a book came out around that time called Tête-à-Tête by Hazel Rowley. And that was a biography on the lives of Jean-Paul Sartre and Simone de Beauvoir together. And I was fascinated by this. And I was also having, my own kind of mini existential crisis at the time, like wondering, what I was doing with my life. And there were a lot of pressures on me to get married and settle down. This was my late 20s. So I saw a lot of my friends doing this, and I was wondering, is that for me? And I'd watched way too many romantic comedies, and I'd kind of internalized this idea of finding the one and living happily ever after, but I wasn't finding the one. And it wasn't, and the ones I were finding, they weren't happy relationships. So I started to have these kind of questions about freedom and responsibility, and how much of ourselves we should be giving up for other people or lovers or boyfriends. And so what I found was that Simone de Beauvoir and Jean-Paul Sartre were asking similar kind of questions. And they were trying to navigate their relationship and really questioning the traditional ideas of what we're supposed to do in relationships. Find the one, get married, have babies, that sort of thing. Because they didn't do that. They didn't want to do that. They pushed back against it. And yet they still had a loving relationship, but they were trying to figure out, how do we be in relationship with other people? How do we commit to other people? But how do we still exercise our own individuality and pursue our own goals and our own dreams and hopes? So it was kind of a convergence and a collision, I guess, of a lot of different factors at that time that really got me hooked on the question of love and what are we required to give up for love, and what does love mean for who we become and the type of people we want to be. So that's where my PhD went, to explore some of those kind of questions. And then that also kind of involved a question of authenticity, which I didn't really go into so much in that first book, but which is why this sort of marinated in the back of my brain somewhere, and the question kind of lingered. So hence my next book.
Yeah, it's a really, really, really fascinating story, and it's cool to see your your passion, and it really feels this genuineness about it, which is really, really nice to bring into these kinds of, ideas that have been talked about a lot, and to have some fresh perspectives. So the book is called How to Be Authentic, Simone de Beauvoir and the Quest for Fulfillment. One of my favorite books this year. I will tell you.
Really?
I promise you. I'm not. There's a few I've liked this year, and this is definitely at the top. It's very good. It's a very, very good book.
So much. Oh, that means so much to me. I really appreciate it. I'm glad.
Yeah. It's well written, but it does a really nice weaving together of philosophy, of some biography aspects of her life and with Sartre, and then also a really nice handle on the pragmatic ways of using this. So it doesn't feel like a really dry and boring philosophy read, which most people have this kind of allergy to philosophy because it's so dry and dense, and it's not relatable, and why are we talking about these things in circles? It's none of that. And so it's very, very good. I've recommended it to many people, and so it's really nice to see all of these ideas kind of coalescing together, and how you organize the book. And so it really is just fabulous. So let's.
Can I just jump in there and say that? Okay, I'm so happy that you took that from it, but it's not like I can take full credit, because that was Beauvoir's methodology as well.
Sure. Yeah.
She wrote in one of her student diaries, philosophy should be lived, or no, she said, my philosophy must be from life. Mm-hmm. And, she was thinking this, as a teenager, and when she knew she wanted to philosophize, and she carried that throughout her life, which was, she thought that these kind of analytical philosophers, which you say are often, quite dry and heavy, mm-hmm. and, she appreciated them, but at the same time, she's like, well, what relevance does that have to my everyday life? Like, how does that matter for the way I'm living, the way I'm interacting with other people, the relationships I'm having, the choices I should be making? And so she specifically stepped away from that whole kind of, she denied the fact that she was a philosopher. She said, mm-hmm. I'm not a philosopher. I'm a novelist. I'm an essayist. Mm-hmm. People like Sartre are philosophers because mm-hmm. they're trying to create a philosophical system. Mm-hmm. But she thought that was kind of crazy, or at least not for her. And mm-hmm. so, mm-hmm. and this is why she wrote novels that had a lot of philosophical themes in them, and she also wrote a lot of letters, which she later published, and she kept diaries, and she published those, and autobiographies. Of course, autobiography was like a large part of her of what she produced, and also even her works that weren't necessarily biography weren't necessarily autobiography, mm-hmm. have a lot of autobiographical elements in them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it reminds me when I was talking to Samantha Rose Hill about Hannah Arendt, because of course, right, if you talk to Samantha, you're going to talk about Hannah Arendt at some point.
yes
And Hannah was very much similar. I'm not a philosopher, don't call me that, but she was very much about the doing piece of things. How do we understand how this impacts our life? And there's a little bit of similarity there with de Beauvoir. They're not entirely similar. They have divergent views on many things, but there's some overlap and similarities too, which is also super fascinating. And I think most of the times people get kind of hung up on like the big systems people, but I think sometimes philosophers that kind of don't interact in that world, the academy or the kind of intellectual circles, and they kind of go away and they get a different perspective, really can offer something to philosophy. I mean, I think, Wittgenstein did this, and he's a big contributor. Nietzsche did that. He was a big contributor to philosophy. So there's a different kind of perspective. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, exactly. And I think it's important that we look at, I mean, philosophy is love of wisdom, right? So I think it's important that we look at philosophy from a more expansive background, especially when it comes to women philosophers who often weren't allowed to be educated or part of the academy, or, if they did express their views, philosophical views, they were accused of heresy or whatever it is. So I think it's really important to include these other ways of philosophizing in the canon.
Absolutely. Yeah. So in the first part of the book, you kind of give a really nice kind of overview in a way that's really synthesized well of the many of the major tenets of what I would see as existentialism. And so we can start with some of these main concepts, because then they'll make sense for some of the particular areas you talk about later in the book. So obviously the big one from the beginning is authenticity. How do you explain authenticity? Why is it important? Or I should say, you can help me along here. You do a nice job of this in the book, so maybe here too. What was de Beauvoir's ideas of authenticity, and then what are your own, or how are you reading her and then trying to understand the ideas about authenticity as a construct?
Yeah, so Simone de Beauvoir, she wasn't really big on definitions, and so she often used these terms. So one of my big challenges in this book was to kind of pull out and create definitions. So my definition of authenticity, based on what I think Beauvoir was trying to say, is that it's a process of creating your essence. So it's really a way of expressing your freedom to intentionally choose who you're becoming. And this is quite different, I think, to a lot of other ideas of authenticity we hear at the moment. It's kind of a buzzword. And, often authenticity is discussed as an inwardness and looking inside you, trying to find, the true you, the true self, like what is the blueprint, like the core of yourself. Whereas Beauvoir's idea is like, well, there is no such thing as, this true self, or like a fixed being that we've kind of got to peel away our layers to get to. Her definition, or her idea of authenticity, is much more outward looking. Like, no, it's about becoming. It's about stretching ourselves into the future. It's about embracing our freedom to choose who we become.
Well, yeah, and in that way, it's in the spirit of Heraclitus, right? Which, he was one of the first to at least write it down about this idea of becoming. And obviously other people have written about this as well. And it's very much, I think, right in that authenticity is not finding the driver, in the car of our bodies, right? And somewhere inside, like we have souls or something like that in this way. It's more of, I totally agree with that, is all of our experiences are telling us something about our elements of ourselves, and how we can have congruence with all aspects of self is important. You mentioned the essence. So one of the big things, I believe it's Sartre, but I don't know if he gets the first claim to it, but existence precedes essence. So anytime I've taught existential theory in therapy, this always puzzles students the first time they hear this. So how do you usually explain existence before essence?
Yeah, and you're right. It is Jean-Paul Sartre, or at least, he coined the term. He became famous for it. And Simone de Beauvoir certainly subscribed to that as well. And really, if I had to sum up existentialism in 3 words, those are the 3 words I would use.
That's good. That's good.
And it's really the core of at least French existential philosophy that Simone de Beauvoir and Jean-Paul Sartre were talking about, meaning that we exist first. So we're like thrown into the world. We don't choose to be born, but once we're here, it's up to us to figure out who we become and to create who we become. So, and that's our essence. So we've got this existence, which is our being, but then our essence is our becoming. And so an authenticity is that process of actively creating our essence.
Yeah, I think I think the first part is hard for people, right? Which is many people want to get to the essence part first, right? Well, who am I becoming? What are my life goals? What am I going to do? Who am I going to marry? Who am I, all these things. But many times people have to sit with the fact that they are, right? That they do exist. It's not their choice. And there are many people that have a hard time with that. Even, when I work with some clinical patients, they, and they're prone to depression, they'll say, I didn't choose to be born and I have to live on this earth of suffering and it sucks. And it's like, why do I, and it's hard. It's really hard. I think the idea of being itself is very difficult of sorts. You can take Kierkegaard, you can take Heidegger, who thought about this, kind of anxiety, this angst of, knowing that we have, a deadline on our time here on earth. It's like, well, how do we do this? But you have to recognize that you exist first. And I think, and then it's okay, understanding that really what that is for you specifically, then you're able to determine where do you find personal responsibility? Where do you find worth? Where do you find value in things? And that can sometimes be very hard for people to kind of get their kind of teeth into that first. But I totally agree with you. Those are the three words for existentialism.
Yeah, and you're right. It is hard for people, and Beauvoir recognized this. She says it's horrifying to realize that we didn't choose to be here and we're thrown into the world, and that's one of the reasons why anxiety is such an integral part of existential philosophy. Mm-hmm. And Simone de Beauvoir very much focused on the ambiguity of existence, and she's like, one of the biggest challenges of life is to try and embrace the ambiguity of who we are and to come to terms with the fact that, sure, we're the sum of our actions, but we have a future ahead of us as well. And, it's how we project ourselves into the world, the goals we set, the intentions we make, the relationships we create. And so this is it's such an unknown. And of course, we live in a world with other people, and so it's kind of chaos out there. That she's like, this is a tension, like a really anxiety-inducing tension of life, and it's a challenge to come to terms with.
Yeah, and in that way, there's a big freedom with that, right? There totally is, and I think more and more and more. I think it's always been the case, but I think more and more with people is people will say, well, what's the right thing for me to do? Or what's the right answer here? What's the right decision? And there isn't one. There objectively isn't one. You could do a variety of things and you're going to have a variety of outcomes. But people want that and they want to have the direction. And that totally is fine. It makes sense. But it's hard, I think, for people initially to say, oh, I don't have to do it this way or could do this way or, okay. And then all of a sudden you see, kind of your horizon open up and you have so many possibilities, you have so many potential, which can be overwhelming. And I think that freedom says, who are you becoming and how do you want to organize that? And I guess the problem with life is that you only get it once, right? You don't get a do-over. You don't get like a third and fourth, iteration. But there's so many possibilities that are out there for people. There's another concept here about intersubjectivity and why that's important for the other. De Beauvoir talks a lot about the other, and obviously she talks about women as being the other in many respects. So maybe just kind of illustrate some of those concepts, intersubjectivity and the other, and those things that she talks about.
Yeah, certainly. So can I mention something else that I'm still thinking about?
Sure. Yeah.
Sorry, sometimes it takes my brain a bit to catch up.
Go ahead.
And this is what you were talking about, this anxiety of the future and everything. I mean, this is the existential leap. And sometimes we don't know who we're becoming until we make a choice and until we step resolutely into the future and commit our being. And so that, and we were also talking about freedom and how that freedom can be dizzying to know that we have choices. But I think where Beauvoir is unique amongst some of the existential philosophers is that she recognizes that there are facts of our lives that can prevent us or prevent many people from making those existential leaps into the future, from making choices from, a range of options from an open future. And so on the one hand, if we start to recognize our existence and say, okay, well, we need to leap into the future. And if we shy away from that, then that's bad faith, which is, another concept we'll come to in a minute. And that's inauthentic. But if we're prevented from making choices, if we're prevented from, choosing our own life path, then that can constitute oppression. And so both are problematic. So one of Beauvoir's goals is to, try and open up future possibilities for everyone. But now I'm going to backtrack to intersubjectivity. So the way I understand Beauvoir's understanding of intersubjectivity is that it's a mutual recognition and respect for one another's freedom. And this comes back to what I was saying about having options and having choices, because if I respect choices for myself, if I respect freedom for myself in order to choose what kind of career I want to pursue, then I should be respecting that for other people too. So this process of intersubjectivity is acknowledging that maybe I'm not the center of the universe, and that other people exist just like me, and other people's lives and their choices matter just as much as my own. And what's the foundation for this? Well, for Beauvoir, it's that we share the same human condition. And this relationship of intersubjectivity, that's really the foundation of ethical behavior for her.
I think it was Sartre, I could be wrong on this, that said, not only do we understand the other, but we're responsible for the other because of our abilities to know the things about the human condition, which, I think some people have obviously debated that, right? It's like, that's a different concept you're putting in there. But for certain, there is in terms of the intersubjectivity piece, yes, we don't live on an island by ourselves. We live on a planet of 8 billion humans and, many, many other organisms. So that we are sharing, home with many other living beings. And you may like some of them, may not like others of them, but that is a fact that you do share the planet with many other folks. And so there's this interesting thing of, well, how do we as people mind our freedom, but also keep in our rear view or maybe in our front view the freedom of others and what they could potentially do. And there becomes this interplay or, between that. So it sounds like it's somewhere along those lines is what you're saying.
Yeah, for sure. And so Sartre talked about that in Existentialism as a Humanism, I think, which was his essay, which was an attempt to kind of clarify some misunderstandings about existential philosophy. And he did say that he wanted to go on and write about existential ethics, but he never really got around to it. He had some notes and that have been published as notebooks for an ethics, but it was really Simone de Beauvoir who took that responsibility and tried to flesh it out. And, she wrote The Ethics of Ambiguity to try and get to the core of like, okay, so existentialism is about freedom. And does that mean we can do whatever the hell we want? Well, or does anything go, as Dostoevsky says? And Simone de Beauvoir was like, no, it doesn't, because freedom is meaningless without responsibility. And without that kind of balance of responsibility, you end up in hedonism or libertinism or something. And that's not what Beauvoir was about. She's like, no, there's this intersubjectivity, which we should be developing and respecting everyone around us, sharing the earth. And so that was her attempt to found an ethics, which is something, say, Jean-Paul Sartre never really did.
Yeah. Well, that's a fantastic piece of work. Obviously, her main work, The Second Sex, is tremendous. It's a huge piece of literature in general, for philosophy, for women's studies, for many, many, many things. It's incredible work. So I guess the other question I have here is about this piece you mentioned in the book about mystifications, right? What are these, and why did you use this concept to discuss various aspects for women? What are your ideas here? You talk about it in the book, but how do you usually explain mystifications and how she applies it?
Yeah, so mystifications are myths or false ideas about who we are and what we're supposed to be. And so one mystification is that we all have this inbuilt essence and we just need to look hard enough to find it, and then we all know who we are. Or another mystification is that there's such a thing as feminine nature or masculine nature. Mm-hmm. She's like, no, they're things that we're brought up with. They're things that we're taught. There's not like this inbuilt essence, feminine essence. And so mystifications are a problem because they're kind of delusions, and they get in the way of authenticity. So they're, for example, feminine nature, masculine nature. I mean, these are things part of our society and culture that we're taught. Oh, to be masculine is not to cry, and it's to be the tough guy and to be strong, whereas to be feminine is to be pretty and not to take up too much space. But for Beauvoir, we create our essence, and so our essence is shaped by these kind of assumptions that people make about us depending on our sex organs. So that limits both boys and girls, both men and women. If men are expected to be one way and are policed, if they don't live up to those masculine, their masculine nature or masculine ideals, and women are policed too, and so. Yeah, these mystifications are problematic because they limit the ways we can express ourselves, and they cause harm when people are trying to police, how men and women should be or should behave.
Mm-hmm. Well, I guess the question I have here is, again, I absolutely hate debates or conversations about defining terms because I just find it cumbersome. However, I think she does talk about it early in the first part of The Second Sex. I guess I'm asking you, based on kind of with her obviously in the room, so to speak, with her thoughts. But how do we a multiple complexity of questions here? Okay, so my first question is, how do we understand or define? It could be a continuum, that's fine. But what is a woman, right? As opposed to not being a woman. And then other synonyms with that in terms of female, in terms of the feminine. I guess you could put girls in there as far as a younger version. But how do we understand how we're creating a category? It's a categorization of sorts. Obviously, there are traditional aspects, and historically, there's been many ways in which other people have defined women or females. But for you, is that question important? Is it necessary? Should we have those categories? How do you see them? How would you define them, etc.?
Yeah, this is a really big question.
Yeah, it's hard. It's hard.
Yeah, and even Beauvoir thought it was ambiguous. And, she wrote The Second Sex, kind of exploring this question, what is a woman, and ended up with 700 or 800 pages, whatever it is. And, and the reason why she started exploring this was because she'd been reading about like manhood and the human condition, and she didn't really think being a woman meant much in her life. She was brought up. She was clearly very intelligent from a young age, and her father used to say things like, oh, Simone thinks like a man. She is a man. And so she didn't initially think that being a woman had much influence on her life. And, after she'd started writing a couple of essays and a novel, Sartre kind of challenged her, and he's like, are you sure that, being a woman hasn't influenced you? And I mean, she was already thinking about this. So it wasn't, Sartre she didn't give such a credit for the whole idea, but he did I think she called him a conversational catalyst, or some kind of catalytic muse for her thinking, and they did that for one another. And she really started thinking about this and realized that girls are raised differently to boys. For example, she didn't have the same education as Jean-Paul Sartre until she got to later college at the Sorbonne. And she started to realize that she was able to capitalize on being intelligent, on being white and being middle class in ways that other women weren't. And she realized that most women had very limited options for work. Women weren't allowed to establish credit or own property. They tended to be defined by who they were married to. So the more she looked into it, the more she realized how different men's and women's situations are. And so that's kind of the direction she went. She went down the path of looking at the different situations. So rather than categorizing women and men based on, I don't know, like sex organs or whatever it is, she's like, are you a woman if you wear a skirt? Well, no. Are you a woman if you have a womb? Well, no, not necessarily, because not all women do have wombs. So she was trying to think about, she's like, how do we kind of reduce women to a particular definition? And she's like, well, what makes a woman is actually the situation that they exist in, and the roles they're channeled into, and so that's why a large part of the second sex talks about situations, the married woman, the woman in love. And she's looking at how being a woman manifests in these different ways, and also how limiting these expectations on women are.
Mm-hmm.
So,
yeah, you're mentioning many of the things in which how women have been historically and still today, and especially in her time, and as women were the other, right? Or in relation to men, right? They were, married to so-and-so, or they could or could not do this, or they could, men could do this and they could not do this, of course. And I think the term is being for themselves and being in themselves. I guess I just think of what this question is. I mean, to be fair, let me just put a footnote here. I mean, you could do the same question for men, males, men, the masculine, manhood, etc. I mean, you could, the same question I asked, you could do the reverse. Mm-hmm. I guess that's why I ask, is it important? I do think, I would think at a certain point it is important. I mean, people do have particular roles. I'm not making an attribution or a value judgment or statement or anything like that. I'm just saying just different roles that people play. But I don't know. I mean, I honestly don't have an answer. Right? I don't have an answer to the question, but I'm thinking of all the conversations I've had with so many people, and sure, people kind of do this kind of interjection. They kind of wear what society tells them, or culture, or things like that, or how they were raised, or norms, or values, or structural things from family, etc. And then that's been the case for thousands of years. I mean, since our humanity as Homo sapiens, we've done much of that for a long time. Mm-hmm. Doesn't make it right or correct or accurate or whatever, but I don't know. I guess my question is that obviously no one's going to agree on this, but is it fair to see it as a continuum where people can say, this is what I see a woman as, and I like these things? That could be very traditional, that could be very alternative, that could be maybe more cosmopolitan or liberal, more conservative. There's a kind of range here of this stuff, yeah? Like there's many people that will say, I'll just use the stereotype, one of the things I've heard this told to me many times, one of the things I enjoy about being a woman is the capacity for motherhood and all these things. And there's a kind of this, motherhood and all of that is very beautiful experience for many women. But I think it's one of those things where like they really enjoy that. They have something that gives them a lot of sense of pride and identity and things. And I don't think there's anything wrong with that. I don't think de Beauvoir wouldn't necessarily say there's anything wrong. She has ideas about motherhood too, which we'll get to maybe, but I don't know. But then you have other people that will say the opposite. It's like, a woman is not, it could be what you want it to be, right? I mean, it doesn't, it's not defined by some of these kinds of limits or boundaries. So I guess my very meandering tangential question here is how do we understand the different definitions that various women themselves have of, the feminine or womanhood? And can we see it as a type of continuum, or is that too ambiguous? Is there a place where we need to have some kind of taxonomy here of this, or what are your thoughts?
Okay, a lot of thoughts.
Yeah, go ahead.
So I think Beauvoir's goal was that we should have the freedom to choose how we want to express our individuality, how we want to express ourselves, whether that means express ourselves as a mother, express ourselves as a woman who is not interested in children. So Beauvoir was specifically concerned, in the second sex especially, as women's situation, as you said, as other. And so the problem is that Beauvoir saw was that men have tended for a very long time to be defined as the universal, mankind. And, they've assumed the role of, the primary kind of being of subject. And whereas women their situation has been defined as other to men. So whereas men are essential, women are more inessential. So Beauvoir's problem was when women are expected to fulfill certain roles, such as if you're expected to be a mother, if society channels you into marriage and childbirth and childcare, and you don't have the option to do otherwise, then for Beauvoir, that's a problem. Or if you're punished socially for choosing other than the norm, then that's a limitation on our freedom. And she would have said that. No, she did say, not would have, she did say that that's limiting for men too. If men are expected to be the breadwinners and expected to look after the wife and children, then that limits their possibilities too. However, it has actually been the case that men have tended to have a lot more freedom than women have. And so Beauvoir's point is that we should all be free to choose how we want to express ourselves as a woman. And her most famous quote is, "One isn't born, but becomes a woman." And so her point is that, this sentence has been debated so much. There are whole books on, what this sentence means. But one of the understandings is that, so we're not born as into this certain kind of role, but we become and we're shaped partly by society, but a different understanding is that we make ourselves into women. So through our choices, through whether we decide to have babies or not have babies, or wear dresses or not wear dresses, So, but the issue is when the category of woman is policed, like you're a woman, or, Beauvoir would know she was often accused of not being a woman or not being a real woman because she didn't get married, she didn't have babies, she dared to write books and speak her mind, and people would say, and so she's like, okay, well, if I'm not a woman just for having those things, then that's people trying to, push me into this particular lane. And so, and she did have certain thoughts on motherhood, as you say, but she thought that, actually she had more issues with marriage than motherhood because, but maybe we can talk about that later, because marriage has so much baggage. And so, but what's important is that we have options, that we can choose, that we can actively choose whether to become mothers or not. And that's why one of her big, campaigns was, she sorry, I'm getting excited.
No, go ahead. No, it's great. It's great. It's
about, contraception and abortion and making those available for women so women can make choices and they aren't like chained to their animal nature, and they can enjoy sex without risk of pregnancy. So that was, and in fact, in the second sex, she has a chapter on motherhood. The first 10 pages of that chapter are on the importance of abortion and the importance of being able to choose whether to bring children into the world.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's super important. It's an interesting thing here. I'll come to the contraception piece in a minute. I guess it's. I did want to ask about progress, but I guess before that, I wonder. It seems maybe I'm not reading it correctly, but it seems as if the real goal or aim here is you can classify or quantify men or women however you want, as long as they have. I hesitate to use this word because it's such a loaded word, but as long as they have true equality, right, where a woman can do anything the guy can do, right? Like there should not be, I mean, obviously there will be, hindrances based on, if someone's, short of stature or, they're, whatever, there's certain physical limitations that some people may have, but that's true for within men and it's true within women. But they can work the same, get paid the same, go to school the same, do everything. That there isn't that seeing women in relation to men, right? That there's not the universality of it. It seems like that's the main aim, right? The main aim is that, right? That's the big thing. And I wonder, it still seems to me though that there are. I don't want to sound prescriptive, but there are roles that people play. There are roles that people do play, which I think is important. I think that is important. I go back to this idea of, I'm not trying to make it sound super idyllic or anything like that, but with hunter-gatherers in the Neolithic period, there was a space where there were roles that people played, and there was, I'm not saying that it was, equality back then, but there was this understanding of you do this and I do this. Okay. And it was not as this time, my understanding of it, of, gross inequality. As we progressed through time, that happened, right? As you started to have land and ownership, and then you have, domestication, all these things are way back in our history, pre kind of modern period. It seems that there's always this idea of roles. What roles do people play? And many times, women may do some of the roles that, men would do or whatever. But I guess I wonder if in modernity, there are things that have been, because there's been thousands of years of this kind of, universality of men kind of, doing things or owning things that that's the norm, or that's what people are used to. So, but because that is the case, that doesn't mean that it's definitely not, equal, and that doesn't make it right or fair or accurate. And so, what do you think about today? It's 2022. It is. I don't really like the term the West, but whatever. We live in in the West in the United States. And there's been a lot of progress. Even since the time from de Beauvoir, there has been much progress. There is still around the world today, currently, some very backwards ways of treating women all around the world. Some really, really horrific ways that women are still treated en masse. But which is obviously problematic, obviously things that we have to continue to work against. But I guess my general question here is what do you think about progress that has been made for women in more liberal cosmopolitan societies? What's the progress that's been made, and where do you see the future of where things should continue to progress?
Okay, so I want to address the first part of what you were saying about how women have been secondary to men for such a long time. And, the division of labor in agricultural communities. So, I mean, Beauvoir says that, an appeals to nature are a mystification. If you say, oh, it's natural that women should be subservient to men, or it's natural that women should have babies, then these are appeals to nature, and they deny that we are beings who can choose, that we can overcome the facts of our existence. And she calls this transcendence. It's when there are facts of our lives. So the fact of a woman having a womb doesn't mean that she should produce children. And we have, as you mentioned, contraception to, make, and that's a form of technology that helps people transcend their animal nature, so move beyond it and open up the future and be able to choose whether or not to have babies. And so I guess progress in terms of technology, medical technology has opened up a lot of choices for a lot of people, not only in certainly lengthening lifespans, but think about manufacturing, and certainly in the past men were on average bigger and stronger, and so they were the ones who went out and did the heavy lifting, and women did things like gathering, and so it's still a question as to why this happened. And Beauvoir says it seems that men, even though, there are machines and there's so much technology, that means like a lot of the differences between men and women don't matter anymore. Think about, the whole, how we're on the internet on the whole time, us talking, we don't need bigger muscles or to do this sort of thing. Like so many jobs, don't need that brute strength anymore. So, technology has helped us, annul those, whatever natural differences in facts of our bodies. So, and back to your other question about progress. I mean, sure, yeah. So we've had a lot of progress in terms of technology, and that's been great to kind of increase equal rights for people. But, Beauvoir was writing The Second Sex in the 1940s. At the time, abortion was illegal and contraception wasn't widespread. And then in 1971, she formed solidarities with other women, and they protested laws against abortion. And that later, like a few years later, led to a change in French law and elsewhere, because that happened in the US in 1973. Yep. But the problem, I think she would be turning in her grave to know that Roe v. Wade in the US is under threat. We seem to be going backwards in some ways, although we haven't gone backwards yet, but it doesn't look good. And the problem is, even in terms of when women are raped or, incest, that sort of thing, if they're still having to have children, regardless, even if they don't want children and they're still expected to, they have to have children, then that's reducing women to their animal nature. It's reducing women to the facts of their existence and denying that, we're able to transcend the facts of our existence and reach into the future and have different options. So that's one of the reasons why Beauvoir was so insistent on, women being able to control their own bodies. And certainly women are still victims of sexual assault and domestic violence and human trafficking and murder. I mean, men are too, but women to a much greater extent. And women of color, even more so. There's still, as you mentioned, there's still, a pay gap. Women of color, even more so. And, women of color can bear the physical and emotional brunt of racial violence. So, there's progress is slow. It is happening, but it's slow. And it requires constant rebellion against oppressive structures, which is why my book kind of, the final chapter, kind of rebellion, because, there are still oppressive structures for men and women. And, it's important because of this concept of intersubjectivity that we talked about before to protect and allow people to make choices about how they want to live their lives and how they want to live authentically.
Yeah, I would say I agree with 100% of everything you just said. I guess my question here is so as an example, I think so. I mean, now, I mean, if you were 60, 70 years ago, it was not acceptable, or it wasn't okay, or it was very rare, or whatever, where women didn't get an education. Now that's, at least in the United States, and much of Western Europe, I'm assuming in Australia, that's not as, I mean, I would say that it's probably not a problem. I could be
Western world, at least, yeah.
Yeah, and I mean, obviously, yes, and much of the world it is still, but in the Western world, that's huge. That's a big deal. I think I could be wrong in this number, but over more than half of medical doctors that graduate are now women. That they are overwhelmingly more, or not, or just now over half than men. I think in many of the social sciences and arts and humanities, there is at least 50, if not more so. Even in my field, in clinical psych, it's like 80 to 80, 20, 80% are women, 20% are men. That wouldn't have been the case. I mean, in the 60s, I mean, clinical psych was all behaviorism. It was all dudes, so, I mean, that's what I mean. Like in that way, I mean, there's really good social progress. I mean, obviously we see more and more women and women of color that are, owning their own businesses, that they're, CEOs, they're running big companies, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, that didn't happen 30 years ago. I mean, it was, one or two cases here, but now we see it more and more often. In those ways, I think, and I'm not trying to say this to say like, oh, see, everything's all done. I fully agree with you. You can't rest on one's laurels. You have to say, hey, this is good, but we also need to make sure we don't regress as a society, or other people, want to, or other groups or entities want to try and have a regressive nature to rewind some of that stuff. And how do we keep pushing forward for some of the other spaces? I want to just talk about the contraceptive piece that you said as well. So, yes, I mean, I firmly agree with you. I mean, I think in general, right, humans should be able to choose what they do with their own bodies. Just full stop. Like, it's just not, we shouldn't have other people telling other people what to do with their own bodies. I certainly think that, men should not be, or majority men should not be telling women what to do with their own bodies, sexually, reproductively, physically, etc. And I agree. I think that it is concerning, for sure, about some of the threats that Roe v. Wade is under. Yeah, people make arguments about how legally it's not the best. I mean, fine, maybe there's some arguments to be made there, but the what it's trying to protect, a woman's choice is key, is essential, and it's super important. And I think that illustrates your point of, look, I mean, it's, we can't rest on just, well, we did that and it's done. I think maybe for some things that can maybe be the case, but I think for most things aren't static, right? They're always in motion, they're always moving. And so it's saying, how do we push as a society more of a place where we see, for men and women, that there's nothing that's hampering women to do what men can do, or that we don't even have to say it that way anymore. It's just like, this is a person and they're doing this. They could be a man, they could be a woman, but they're able to do this, much as you said, with technology advances. So I fully agree with you on that point. But I guess just, I don't know if you want to say anything about the some of the other social progress that I mentioned for women in the West.
Yeah, and I will say, yes, there's a lot of progress has been made in many areas. Education and women working is a lot more acceptable and a lot more widespread than it was in Beauvoir's time. And yet there are still a lot of industries where roles are hugely gendered. For example, in Silicon Valley, it's very male dominated. And, part of that is based on a mystification that men are better at STEM than women, which has the evidence isn't there. Girls perform better at school than boys, but these cultural or gender expectations start coming in. Women, girls tend to be taught from a very young age, to sort of take a back seat, and this is still happening, a back seat to boys. And women are still largely in caregiving roles when it comes to nurses and things like that, and teachers, and those sort of roles are often paid less than industries where men dominate. And we still haven't had the woman president of the United States, and so women are still barred from the top leadership positions of countries and organizations, and there's still a really big gap there. So I think that's still hindering us, although there is some progress. And just one other thought I had about contraception and abortion is that and this has been talked about in the media, but Beauvoir said it as well. She writes about it in The Second Sex that, privileged, wealthy women, they'll always be okay. They will be able to afford to travel, to see, doctors in clean conditions and have, the procedures done and without risk to their lives. But the problem is that women who aren't privileged are the ones who are going to suffer. So banning abortion makes it a class crime. Because the women who can least manage it, if they don't want a child, if they don't have the capacity for a child, they're the ones who are going to suffer. And so we're punishing, the most underprivileged people in our society with this.
Yeah, I mean, I fully agree with you, and it's. I really get frustrated where people will say, well, you just go to another state and get something done. And that's the most, fucking ridiculous statement to make, because if you live in some place like, let's say, Oklahoma or Nebraska or Texas, or, the next state is like 4 states away. Like and that's even beside the point. Like, it shouldn't have to be, you have to leave your state to go and exercise your right to, choose what you want to do with your own body. That's absurd. That's absurd. And again, it's frustrating. I'm not, I'm not a woman, but it's very frustrating. It's very, very frustrating. And so I can only imagine what it must feel like for many women out there that, have to, possibly consider some of those things. As you said earlier, nothing has happened yet. Hopefully nothing will, but it is, important for people to say, hey, there's a real threat there. And to give people, to me, I think that gives people the ultimate choice, right? Not having that ability or that option is restricting choice, restricting freedom. And I still don't understand. I mean, I kind of understand some of the conservative arguments for it, but I guess I just don't understand why you wouldn't want people to have choice in the matter.
Yeah, and Beauvoir says, the biggest hypocrisy of all is that the people who are trying to legislate against abortion don't care about the children when they arrive. Like, they don't actually care. Like, there's no, especially in the US, like, healthcare is hugely problematic, and as we're seeing, for example, the baby formula shortage and things like that. Like, there's little care and support for mothers, for children, once they do come into the world. Maternity leave is not a widespread thing here in the US. So we're kind of forcing women to have, if we're forcing women to have children, then, we're bringing children into a world of often poverty, often situations where these children aren't wanted. Isn't that like the worst of all worlds?
Yeah, I mean, 100%. I mean, it's a big hypocrisy. I detest that Republican Party is the party of family values, which is absurd to me. There's no one party that has family values, and it's a antiquated vestige from the 70s and 80s from the Republican Party that they still keep recycling because for various reasons. But Yeah, I mean, they don't, the foster care system in the United States is a wreck. It's an absolute wreck. Healthcare system in the United States is tremendously problematic and difficult and not efficient at all. And it's this real big thing of like, they get real animated about, what happens before someone's born, and then after they're born, they don't care, or they don't, they're cutting these programs, or they're cutting people's accessibility to certain things. And I don't understand that. And it's just hard to make it feel, this feels inauthentic, right? It doesn't feel, you're trying to win points for whatever reason. And, at the end of the day, it's real people, right? It's real people's lives at stake. And again, people should have the choice to do what they want. Again, mindful of how it impacts other people, of course. Yeah. But we should be giving people the option as a society. We should agree, hey, it's your life. It's your body, and you should be able to make what choices you want to make there.
By the way, this is another, like, one of the things I've been hearing in the media is, oh, well, it's part of the Constitution. And Beauvoir would call this a mystification, which is an appeal to tradition, or, a constitution or laws that were created, a really long time ago that fail to acknowledge that we're humans, we change, we grow, we invent new technologies, and it fails to acknowledge, we're in a very different place now as a society to when we were when the Constitution was written. And the same goes for gun laws, but let's not get into that now. Yeah. I didn't actually comment on that.
I totally agree. I agree with you. I mean, I'll say, I don't think you're not saying this either, but I definitely have a huge respect for tradition, a huge respect for certain norms or values. I think there's a kind of, history and time of people and everything. There's some big importance for that stuff. Really, really big importance for that stuff. But it's not, it shouldn't be treated as, the fifth gospel or something ridiculous, right? Like, these things, again, they're not static, right? They're moving. And I think you can keep the spirit of it, the aspirational aspect of many of these things, but things are changing. They're moving. It's astounding to me that, I guess the last, amendment we had was in 92 or 93 or whatever it was. And it was, but really you have to go back a couple years before that. There were always amendments, just like there are in other countries, even here in the United States, where we were making amendments, and as things would change with time, we would say, okay, we make this, 27 amendments, I believe. And we just haven't done that. And it's like, there's so much that's changed in the past 30 years. So much, so quick, so much more than probably the 20th century put together. And we're still trying to act like we're, in, the late 18th century. I just don't understand why you wouldn't, as a society and a culture. And it does feel on one side very, again, it's not genuine. It's very inauthentic. And so, it's very challenging. It's very, very challenging. The middle part of the book, you talk about various situations, and there's some really, really interesting and really fascinating situations that you give. I won't go over all of them because I want people to read the book and be able to read it at length. But there's a few things here. I definitely want to talk about kind of romantic love. You've thought about that and talked about that a lot, obviously. Before we get there, let's just start with friendship, right? She talks about friendship, how does she see friendship as an authentic moral attitude, and how does reciprocity and intersubjectivity fit in with friendship, and how she views that?
Yeah, so friendship is really important in Beauvoir's philosophy, which is why I started with that in terms of situations. And so Beauvoir talks about being, like existence, in terms of being for yourself, being for oneself, and being for others. So being for ourselves is how we create ourselves and how we make choices in our lives. But being for others is also super important, because that is acknowledging that others exist, and we can only really learn about ourselves through our interactions with other people. Now, we need both of these dimensions. So, for example, women have often been relegated, far into being for others. So, being relegated into caretaking roles, and sort of existing purely for other people, whereas being for oneself is, you don't want to be purely for yourself, because that's really narcissistic and self-centered. And so for Beauvoir, existence is a tension between these two sort of extremes or dimensions. And how do you keep that tension? Well, being with others. And so this is her idea of friendship, is the path or the key to being with others. And so ideally, friendship or relationships of all kinds, but would be based on friendship, which means, having an intersubjective relationship, having, a reciprocal respect, being cooperative, being constructive. I mean, sure, you can be critical of other people, but as long as it's not negative, as long as it's positive criticism. And so she thought that great friends do make space for one another to express themselves, to make space for one another's subjectivity. And, ideally being with friends, being with a good friend, is a safe space. And it's letting go of the desire to control or dominate the other person. And her idea here is, I see it as a direct criticism of Jean-Paul Sartre, because, of course, Jean-Paul Sartre was like, no, all relationships are conflict and love is doomed. And, we're always stuck in this sadomasochistic cycle of wanting to control other people, or, giving up and letting them control us. And he thought that there might not be any escape from this vicious circle. Whereas Beauvoir was like, no, come on, just be good friends. Just don't dominate the other person. Just let go of that desire. Yes, you can overcome it. So this is, what I see as one of her most compelling, ideas, and, how we can, get over that conflict with others, is to try and be better friends.
Yeah, I wonder. There's obviously a robust amount of literature on the fact that, evolutionary, psychology and theory of, how we are social animals, at the very least. Not just that, but we're social mammals, and it's such a innate part of who we are, right? That we are in groups, and that we really, really, as we understand interdependence, cooperation, obviously reciprocity, we understand, punishment, and we understand rewards, and we understand so many things. Cooperation is in so many aspects of, within the animal kingdom, but also at a very multidimensional and abstract level for us as humans. And friendship is I think a key part of that, in terms of what it means to be a social being. And so I don't know, maybe people have written on this, kind of a comparative kind of thing, but I think philosophically, I like good science. I like good empirical data, but you need a good philosophical underpinning for any of that stuff. So, I think I agree with you. I think her philosophy, or her ideas or thoughts, in this space on friendship is really helpful as a kind of theoretical underpinning or theoretical base of how we conceptualize these things. And then you can kind of use, obviously empirical data and studies to try and say, how do we understand some of the nuances of this, or certain points are reliable and valid and all that really important stuff. But I think as a kind of a way of how one can conceptualize friendship, I think she has this kind of mode very well tuned about the importance of friendship.
Yeah, and just on that, as you say, the human species has evolved because of cooperation. But she says, I think her idea is that we can do better. Like there's oppression. There are people who aren't respecting each other's subjectivity. There are people who are dominating others. And, we still see it with sexism, racism, homophobia, like xenophobia. So this is, so we're probably going to survive. But she kind of envisaged a better world. She's like, it's, and I mean, she's utopian in a way because she thought that we need to focus on kind of getting rid of domination and oppression and building kind of new foundations of the world based on freedom, based on intersubjectivity, based on friendship. And then, if we can do that, then we can all be more authentic.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting because, her views on friendship are, they resonate with me, and I agree with you. I think they're very strong. And then her views on romantic love are very interesting, and then kind of branched out from that, marriage, very interesting. Before you tell me about her kind of more or less philosophical ideas about those concepts, how much do you think her relationship with Jean-Paul Sartre influenced her philosophical thought? I mean, is it too much to say it was too much in her head or too much when she was putting pen to paper on some of these things? Is that just an inference? How much of a role did that play with some of her ways of thinking about these things?
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to say specifically, but certainly they talked about all their ideas together. They edited one another's work all the time. From her, they never got married. They had an open relationship, and people say, oh, well, of course, that was Sartre just wanting to sleep around. But, Beauvoir was talking about this, or toying with the ideas, at least in her diary, her student diaries, before she even met Sartre. Mm-hmm. So I think, a lot of Beauvoir's ideas are, she had a lot of them before she met Sartre, and that's why her student diaries, which have only actually been published in English fairly recently, are really important. She went beyond Sartre's philosophy. She took some of the, worked out some of the core tenets of existentialism with him, but then, she took it much further. I'm sure her relationship with Sartre influenced, her ideas, and they certainly, the stories are in her novels are very much, she claims they were loosely based on her real life, but then if you read her autobiographies, it's like there are so many similarities between them. But there are certainly other people who influenced her life just as much as Sartre, if not more. For example, there was a book that came out just last year. It was like a novel called The Inseparables, or Inseparable. That she wrote about one of her best childhood friends who died. And that's only just recently been published and translated into English. And that friendship with Zaza was the friend's name, was, I think, hugely influential on Beauvoir's work, because this is where she got her ideas about great friendship and love that could be generous and wanting the best for the other person, regardless of whether you're your best friends for them, or regardless of whether you have a future together. And Zaza died tragically I think she was about 21 of encephalitis or meningitis, and this, I think that potentially that relationship influenced Beauvoir more than Jean-Paul Sartre.
Yeah, it's incredible how people's stuff keeps coming out many years. She died in 86. Am I right on that? I think that's right. Yeah. So it's 36 years later. It's incredible how we still getting like new stuff of sorts, or new to people, to really kind of fill in those gaps of sorts. Maybe just give us kind of the, I guess, overview of her kind of general landscape of her ideas on romanticism or romantic love, marriage, etc.?
Yeah. So, I mean, I think a good place to start with that is her definition of authentic love, which she says authentic love must be founded on reciprocal recognition of two freedoms. So, of course, like that's her one sentence definition that she talks about in The Second Sex. And so really that's kind of where she's talking about that intersubjectivity, respecting each other as individuals, supporting each other's individual goals, but also thinking about how you can transcend together towards shared values and shared goals. So it's a combination of becoming your authentic self, but also becoming with another person, and trying to create that kind of respectful relationship where both people can flourish. And this is her definition, that she's talking about authentic love, not romantic love. So this is all forms of love, whether it's between friends or between lovers or between married couples or between parents and children. And so part of this definition is also that the people in the relationship, quite often when, think about when people come together and they're in a relationship and then they ignore all their friends and, kind of detach from the world. Okay, so she was like, no, that's not authentic love. Authentic love is recognizing the connection between you and being generous between you, but also recognize that you live in a context, you live in a world with other people. And so it's also, being generous towards the universe. And also this is what Jean-Paul Sartre and Simone de Beauvoir seem to have. They had, companionship and intimacy, and they were writers, and they had this beautiful life in Paris together, but they also gave each other space when they needed it. And for example, they never lived together. And Beauvoir loved to hike, but Sartre hated being outdoors. He hated nature. And so she would go like hiking on her own, but then they would go on vacation together, and they would go on vacation with friends, and they would go on vacation separately. So they were kind of juggling these different, I guess, relationships in their life. And, it didn't always work out for everybody. But for them in their relationship, what I respect is that they did try to create a relationship that worked for them and founded on what sounds a lot like Beauvoir's definition of authentic love.
It's interesting because there's a broad view of romantic love in this authentic way, which is really important. How does that kind of map onto the constitution of marriage, right? Was she resistant to the concept, like, that's not needed, we don't need to do that anymore? Or was it, no, it has its place and maybe it's cool for some people and there's value to it? Or how did she kind of see, I guess romantic love in that context?
Yeah, so she was extreme, like, as I mentioned this earlier briefly, but she was extremely skeptical of marriage. And the reason was that marriage comes with so much baggage about gendered expectations. So, I mean, on the one hand, people say, oh, marriage gives people a sense of security. And Beauvoir was like, well, does it? Like, it's actually a false sense of security, because you can always get divorced, and marriage doesn't secure love. But part of the problem is that there are so many incentives, like government incentives, for people that channel people into getting married. There are tax benefits, there's medical insurance. And so she recognized that this was, something that was rewarded, like getting married is rewarded socially, financially. But the problem is, as I said, these gendered expectations, which is, for example, the expectation of a wife is to provide sexual services, home care services, childbearing services to the husband, and the husband is expected to be the breadwinner, so to provide financial services and support. And so her skepticism of marriage was because these, she said it's really hard not to fall into these kind of tropes, and these kind of gendered scripts. They create inequality, and because they create an imbalance of power. And for example, when you get married, if there's a baby, often, still what happens now is that often a woman's career takes a back seat to the man's. And the women who do try to do it all, they end up, doing just as much housework, or doing all the housework and working a full-time career and juggling babies. So they end up with what's called the double day, or the mental load, this sort of thing. And we're seeing this now. And so her core problem with marriage is that it encourages people to kind of give up their transcendence and kind of fall back into these scripts that we hear about and that we see in pop culture constantly. But, okay, I'll say, but there's a but. Okay. And I think this is kind of, it is a little surprising to me that Beauvoir went with this but. Like, she did see possibilities for authentic marriages. And she thought that as long as you can come together in an agreement, in a union between consenting adults, and if you can create a marriage that's equal, and where both people are generous and both people respect each other's goals and hopes within the relationship, then maybe there is a possibility for authentic love. But so there's a window there for authentic marriages, but it's a small one.
She leaves a crack on the back door to maybe.
Yeah.
Yeah, I would say that. I mean, I totally hear her points on that. And I think you're right, writing this in the 40s. Yeah, I don't know if she imagined a world where it is today, where things are different. I mean, I know many people that are married, and they have even in terms of division of labor within the house and childcare and things like that. I mean, it's pretty equal. I mean, it is very fair. I mean, this person's doing this person's doing this. One person does, sometimes the man does all the cooking, or 75%, and the woman doesn't. Or, I mean, I could probably start listing off couples that I know that do that. Now, again, I don't live with them. I'm not married. I don't know what goes on behind closed doors, but from talking to both of them, or individually, they'll say, yeah, it feels equal. This person supports my career and I support them. And like, I think that's possible. I'm nothing's perfect, but I think you can get pretty close to that. And I think also that, I think that the concept of marriage I agree, it has a lot of baggage, I think. But I also think that it is it's a norm or tradition that says, in one way, it's the highest commitment. And again, that's not to say that people that don't get married and they have a lifelong partner, that they're not committed. I'm not saying that. That's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is that it's the highest commitment, legally, financially, socially, familially. Like it's like on paper, it's on, like, vows were shared and there was witnesses and there's a whole thing. If you do any kind of wedding, if there's, and it is difficult to end, right? Divorce is never easy, even if it's like, we don't get along, irreconcilable differences, you go your way, I go my way. Okay, cool. It's still a process. It's money. It's, and sometimes that's a bad thing, right? Especially I'm thinking of folks that are in domestic violence situations. But, I think one positive of it being difficult is that it should be. If it's the highest commitment you make, I think you should really, really honor that commitment that you make. It's the biggest piece. People may disagree with me on that, but I think that, I don't think everyone needs to be married. I don't think everyone should, necessarily should. Whatever. If people do have a partner, they don't get married, that's fine too. But I think that marriage has now, in our modern space, a place of flexibility. I think you can fashion it a little bit, and how we understand people and how we try to treat each other in that kind of union and that kind of committed union, more equally. So I don't know your thoughts on any of that, but.
Yeah, and Beauvoir would say, we need more of those kind of relationships where they're flexible, where they're equal, where, and it's not just, I'll unpack the dishwasher today, you unpack it tomorrow. It's like, right. It's a matter of, making sure that, people are putting equal effort into the relationship. But the reality is that, across the board, like across the world, women are still doing more.
Oh, for sure. For sure.
And more childcare and we do, I think we both live in fairly privileged areas. And I think, as you were saying about your friends, like a lot of them are unequal. I'm so happy to hear that, because I know I would struggle to list friends who are in marriages where things like that are equal, but it doesn't mean that they don't exist. And yes, we just need more of them. So that's great.
Yeah. And I would say, I don't think, because it's still very much the norm, the kind of traditional way of doing things, I think that I don't think that the whole institution or concept of marriage should be done away with. And I don't necessarily think she's saying that either, or you're saying that, but I do think it just takes, again, right? It's slow. Change is slow. And I think that, I think if we slowly have, evolving, norms in society about how we can see folks in that kind of union more equally, both abstractly and in practice, I think then the concept becomes, interesting. There's about the romantic love piece about this whole like protecting the individuality of somebody. I want to read this quote because it's one of my favorites and it applies here. And I'm curious for your thoughts on it. So I'm sure you know the poet Rilke. Yeah. So there's this quote. It's one of my favorites. This is the quote. It says, "The point of marriage is not to create a quick commonality by tearing down all boundaries. On the contrary, a good marriage is one in which each partner appoints the other to be the guardian of his solitude. And thus they show each other, the greatest possible trust. A merging of two people is an impossibility, and where it seems to exist, it is a hemming in or a mutual consent that robs one party or both parties of their fullest freedom and development. But once the realization is accepted that even between the closest people, infinite distances exist, a marvelous living side by side can grow up for them. If they succeed in loving the expanse between them, which gives them the possibility of always seeing each other as a whole and before an immense sky." Now, I don't know what it was in German. I think he was German. It's a beautiful quote. It's a beautiful quote, which I think captures a lot of what you were saying earlier about de Beauvoir's thought about respecting the individuality of people in a committed romantic partnership. I think that's super important.
Yeah, and Beauvoir talked about some of these exact same themes. Like, I was amazed, like, when you were reading it out. It's like, merging as an impossibility. Yeah, Beauvoir was pushing back against that kind of Disney, or, I say Disney, Disney's changing. But that kind of classic of idea of soulmateship. And, she also talked about how we need to accept the other in their difference and even love the difference, love the distance between us, and acknowledge when another needs solitude and when togetherness is needed. And I think that's a beautiful quote. And yeah, there are a lot of similarities.
Yeah. So one piece here on the situations, and then we can move towards the end. Just real quick about motherhood. She had some strong opinions, I think, about motherhood, or seemingly it's been viewed that way, very strong opinions. And you talk about it in the book, and what are your, I guess, thoughts about her view or positions on motherhood and how it looks and for her?
Yeah, so she was skeptical, but she didn't really say, I mean, she never said don't have kids. Of
Mm-hmm.
course, she just acknowledged that it's really hard, and she didn't have children, and that was an intentional choice. And I think she saw how important it was to be able to make choices about that. And another mystification that she pointed out was maternal instinct. And she says, maternal instinct kind of is this myth that challenges women into thinking that their destiny or their highest destiny is to, have and raise children. And the problem is that this is a way of policing women, because it rewards women who do kind of lean into that kind of destiny, but it punishes women who don't, or like choose not to or can't have children for being faulty or something. And she thought this was a real problem, and that we needed to, get rid of this idea of maternal instinct and say, no, it's like being a mother or being a caregiver, being a parent is, it's a relationship between people, between a child and the caregiver that has to be nurtured, and that's not static. And so let's not rely on, this mystical, like thing that we're calling maternal instinct. And, think about the relationship, think about how we can create an authentic, intersubjective relationship with a child. And of course, the child is completely dependent on a caregiver, especially in the beginning. So it's not equal, but it is a matter of kind of supporting children to enter into these kind of intersubjective and reciprocal relationships.
The end of the book, or the last part of the book, was great. You bring it home really well, so I won't give it too much of a spoiler for people. It's really, really nice. So just a few questions here. The first one is, you talk about this self-sabotage of narcissism and mysticism, and so and I think it's kind of in the context of some of these self-help kinds of things, and I think you made a brief reference to in the beginning. Just kind of your thoughts, and expand on that a little bit.
Yeah, so Beauvoir thought that there are lots of things that trap us into, when I was talking before about being for oneself or being for others. So narcissism and mysticism are kind of manifestations of the extreme being for others or being for oneself. So narcissism is the extreme of being for yourself. Mm-hmm. And that's a problem, because it's like you're creating this idealized image of yourself and masking, your real appearances. And, I think about social media all the time, but I think Beauvoir would say that the problem is with a lot of curated Instagram posts or whatever, that we're trying to create a cohesive portrait of ourselves and as this sort of static, statuesque kind of being, whereas she would say, well, no, existence isn't like that. Becoming authentic is much more of a process of evolving, and we're fragmentary beings. And so, she would advise not to get caught up in narcissism. And then mysticism can be inauthentic, but not necessarily. Where she says, the issue with mysticism is when we're voluntarily subordinating ourselves to, some kind of unquestioned power, or putting unconditional trust in something else, and to make decisions for us rather than us making decisions about our own lives. And the problem with mysticism can be that we're ignoring important questions about the world. And this is one of my favorite discussions in the book, actually, is Teresa of Avila, who was a Spanish mystic nun, and she was a rebel. Like, she rebelled against her father to become a nun. She rebelled against the Protestant Reformation and the Spanish Inquisition, and rebelled against the expectations of what a woman should do and what a woman should be. And people accused her of being stubborn and disobedient, because she taught people. She advised people, and she wrote about her ideas. and it's interesting if you read her work. She starts all her books by, "Oh, I'm just a stupid woman, and I don't know what I'm talking about," kind of thing. And she's like, "No, it's an accident that God chose me as like the conduit for His word," and it's really like she was accused of heresy so many times, and she managed not to be. But this is, Beauvoir really thought Teresa was kind of an existential hero, because, one of the big things is she wasn't just interested in mysticism for herself, but she was interested in teaching other people. She would encourage people to think for themselves. She would encourage, learning and introspection. And she was really passionate about this kind of quest. So I guess my point is that, mysticism is not necessarily inauthentic, but it can be if we give up our kind of capacity to think for ourselves.
You mentioned earlier about rebellion. You talk about it towards the end of the book. How does de Beauvoir talk about rebellion, and why do you think this is really important for many people?
Yeah, so rebellion is super critical because, as I said, to live authentically is to be able to create ourselves. But the problem is so many people are prevented from creating themselves in ways that they freely choose. And so the authentic response to those barriers, to that kind of oppression is rebellion. Rebellion against unfair structures, to get rid of domination, to try and get rid of oppression. And this is important for all of us because she says justice can never be created within justice, within injustice. And that goes back to what I was saying before, like none of us can truly live authentically or create ourselves authentically until all of us can create ourselves authentically. And she uses a metaphor of like stones in an arch. So she's like, well, humanity is like stones in an arch. So we're all these little individual stones, but we're supporting each other together. And she's like, the sturdier the stones, the sturdier the arch. And so if like bits of those stones start to crumble and disintegrate, then that makes the arch weaker. So this is why she became much more of an activist later in her life, because she started to realize that she was privileged, but other people weren't. And so she kind of used her voice and her platform to support other women and fight against injustices. And she recommends that we do the same. Like, even if you're privileged, you have a responsibility to fight against oppression for yourself and other people.
Well, that just kind of ties into my last question, which is, what do you find is the most important and enduring, feature of her thoughts for our modern world, and what's her legacy, and how do we continue on many of the things that she was, thinking and writing about?
Yeah, so I think what I found to be her most important point is that, authenticity isn't about finding who you are. It's, an existential quest for authenticity asks much more of us. It asks, who are you becoming? How are you creating yourself? How are you supporting others creating themselves? And we need to be kind of getting out of bed and asking ourselves those sort of questions every day.
No, I fully agree with you. I mean, I think that's something that is true empowerment for each person. And you only have you. At the end of the day, you can only manage your thoughts and your feelings and your actions and behaviors. And then by doing that, you're able to have potentially very positive ripple effects for others around you. And I think that's super, super important. The book is called How to Be Authentic, Simone de Beauvoir and the Quest for Fulfillment. Where can people find the book, and where can people find you and all your work?
You can find the book in all good bookstores from August 16, but you can pre-order now. And I'm on social media, Twitter, Instagram, Skye_Cleary. And yeah, this has been great, Xavier. Thank you so much for these beautiful questions.
I was going to say, thank you so much for coming on. I was very fulfilled with the conversation. It really was such a pleasure, and you have such a wonderful mind and way of thinking about things and explaining her thoughts as well. And I really have enjoyed talking to you. So I greatly appreciate it.
I've enjoyed this conversation too. Thank you, Xavier.
All right.